This is episode 4 of my dad's series, 5 Reasons We're Going Nowhere. On July 19th, Dad talked with Madi Burton about what the Christian community can learn from business. Here's some background on Madi. Madi has spent most of her professional career working with small to mid-sized companies. As part of her experience, she's helped companies get off the ground by taking the lead as a project manager to help companies satisfy their goals. This summer, Madi has been staying with us as she gives advice for both my mom's stoplight approach and has been consulting for my dad's Assembli initiative, which is still in its early stages. I'm excited to see it launch later this year. Madi is a passionate and driven young professional, which I hope you'll notice in this recording. Enjoy.
So today we're looking at the things that the business community can teach the rest of us who are engaged in mission and mobilizing the church to have or make a difference in the world. We're joined today by Madi Burton, and she's already been introduced, so we're glad to have her here with us today. Constantly, I'm amazed by when I travel, when I do things, regular things that shopping or whatever. I'm always looking and analyzing how things are working. And I'm amazed at how many systems are invisible, sort of underneath the surface, helping businesses and organizations in the public world work together. And those businesses are taking advantage of systems that have involved perhaps thousands and thousands of hours of collaboration to build. And a great example that I often think of is how baggage is moved around the world. So you get on a plane in Vancouver, Canada, and you end up in Kampala, Uganda. Usually you fly through Europe. You're in 3 continents, 3 different countries, perhaps a couple of different airlines, and baggage handling systems all over the place, working together so that 99.9% of the time, those bags, probably higher than that, those bags get to where they're meant to be. So I can pick them up and be home a few hours later. That involves an incredible amount of collaboration. And yet, at the same time as the collaboration is going on, every one of those companies is in some way competing with each other. And that fascinates me. I think it leads us to maybe a bit of a reprimand or a challenge to the Christian community that we have a lot to learn from the business world. We have a global community of over 1 billion people and probably millions of organizations that could be working together and pushing each other through innovation and some healthy competition, pushing each other to do better. We also have what I would call an excess capacity, meaning that there's a lot of resources of all types in the Christian community that are not being tapped. As you know, there's some of the new business models that have come to the forefront in the last few years are platform models like Airbnb and Uber and so on, who are designed around the concept of excess capacity. We tap in to a resource that already exists, and we find a new way to exploit or to leverage that resource to make some profit. And in the end, the world's a better place because resources are being used more efficiently, even in a purely business sense of thinking. So just comment a bit how you see that from a business perspective. What can we learn from that that we should be exploring and applying in the humanitarian and sort of the social and spiritual things that the church is called to do in engaging in the world?
Yeah, I think what you were beginning the conversation describing is a beautiful picture of how the business world comes together to accomplish a single mission, which is to serve the end customer, the mission being making profit, correct? So the process you were walking through with the bags and how they all work together is a single picture of the supply chain. So when you have all of these thousands of companies, each with their own component and their own piece of what they do, partnerships are required, collaboration is required, because in the world that we live in post-industrialization, you have something that I need, and I have something that my friend over here needs, and all of us are trying to make a profit off of what we do. So when I was working toward the beginning of my career, I did some work in supply chain, and one of my mentors told me, money only enters the supply chain one time. There are thousands of transactions that go between when the product is created and when the product is delivered. But money only comes in when the consumer actually makes the purchase. Otherwise, it's just a lot of trading of money back and forth. And to your point, that requires a high level of collaboration and coordination. And it also requires each individual component performing at its highest and best use. You talked about efficiency. I think in the business world specifically, I think there are examples of times where companies can have lag or have excess capacity, but in general, when we're talking about small business, you have to weed out excess capacity. You have to squeeze every dollar for what it's worth. You have to go and evaluate every process to figure out how do you make it faster, smarter, take less resources to create the same amount of product. And that process is what makes you competitive, because to your point, we do have thousands of companies that are competing to serve the exact same purpose. So that process of becoming more efficient and weeding out the poor processes, and it's not done perfectly in the business world, right? But I think that you do see an example that people are motivated to become more efficient in their operation on a day-to-day basis. That combined with the need to collaborate to produce the end product brings us to this, most of the time, highly effective supply chain where you are getting the product from beginning to end and money is entering through the consumer. So what you're asking, talking about not-for-profits in the humanitarian world, how do you see that? Or where do you see, you talk about excess capacity, what seems to be missing from your perspective?
Yeah, I think some of it comes down to the motivation. One of the reasons that there's healthy competition in the business world is because there's a fairly clear motive and a bottom line, and so you compete because you want to get ahead and you want to be successful, but you also collaborate for the same reason. So you work together because it's still about your own survival, and so we look for partnerships, for relationships that ensure our survival, and businesses do that as well. So it's fascinating that to some degree there seems to be a lack of some of that need for survival that holds us back from doing whatever we need to do to collaborate, even in the social sector. And I'm wondering if that comes back to the idea that, and maybe there's sort of an unhelpful sort of Christian attitude here, that we don't need to try to survive because we'll always exist, and we will always be supported, and nobody's going to make us shut down. So we have there's no mechanism that helps us stop or cease to exist or say we're done and now we can shut down. In the business community, if you at some point start to lose enough profit, it becomes unprofitable, you have to make a decision. You may shut down. In the Christian world, when is that, right? You could be completely unprofitable in terms of making a difference in the world, but friends, family, church will continue to support you and not ask the tough questions. And it's a lot of the support systems in the Christian community are based on relationships. So it gets really sort of complicated and sensitive, because it's your friends and your family who would have to say, "Hey, Mark, you need to shut down," and then that comes back to relationship, so it makes it difficult.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. In most of the time, I'm not going to say not for profits, but I'm going to say in the Christian community specifically, there's not a defined metric of success. It's very difficult to look at a Christian organization and make a judgment call to say, you are not being successful in what you're doing, because we are all fed this idea, at least in the Western evangelical world, that when you understand the complexity of eternity and the weight of eternity, there's this mentality that it doesn't matter what you do, if only one soul gets saved, it's worth it. And I think I believe that, but it makes it very challenging when you try to think about an organization or a ministry whose purpose is to serve a humanitarian need, yet there's an underlying theme, which is to share the gospel. So I think it makes it nearly impossible for an individual to make a judgment call on whether a ministry is actually being, quote unquote, successful, because there is not a defined metric of success. So how do you see that?
You're saying something that I've said for a number of years, and I have to say it carefully because, again, as we do often in this podcast, we're stepping on toes. There are people that are called to help one person. Their entire life they're dedicated to helping one person, perhaps. Nothing wrong with that. And if that's what God has called you to do, you need to do that. But thankfully, God has built humanity to be diverse, and many people are gifted and talented with many different roles, and together we form a community that can actually have a big impact in the world. So while some people are called to impact one life, one at a time, others are called to look at some of the deeper fundamental systemic issues that could ultimately, it'll take longer to see the results, but ultimately perhaps affect thousands or millions or billions. So somebody at the end of the day has to look at that bigger picture and say, collectively, as a whole Christian community, putting all of our resources together most efficiently, how are we going to do that to impact the world? So we become a steward not just of the individual person with the individual resource, but we need to be a steward of the whole community together and look at it as in a collective way. And that sometimes seems to be pitting that big picture thinking against the little picture thinking. Both are needed. The micro and the macro are needed. And we need better systems, I think, in the Christian community. The business community has done this already, I think, to a far greater degree than we have. But we need better systems that enable us to celebrate the local small initiatives. When I say small, I don't mean insignificant, but to provide that macro context that brings those things together to create the synergy and the critical mass, the alignment that is needed for us to tackle the big issues of the world. So it's one thing to help one refugee child, which we do in our home. But if we're going to prevent millions of more refugee children from having to face the same trauma that our refugee child faces, we're going to have to get our act together and collaborate on those bigger issues. Another thing we're doing in L555 and the platform we're building called Assembli, we're exploring this concept of key measurable objectives. Now, we may rename that. We're still not sure exactly the wording we'll use. But the point there is that we start to, this sounds bad maybe, but we start to depersonalize the strategy a bit. In the past, the strategy across much of the world especially when it comes to missionaries and sort of the small ministries all over the world. It's very personal. So, Mary is doing a great job, or Mary is not doing a great job. But if Mary is not doing a great job, we don't want to fire her because she's our sister, right? And so it becomes very complicated and sort of sensitive. But if we stop talking about Mary, instead we talked about something along the lines of key measurable objectives, then we can say, hey, Mary is working on these 3 key measurable objectives. Objective number 1 is doing great. We need to keep supporting her to do that. Objective number 2 is okay. We need to evaluate it. Objective number 3 is failing, and we need to find somebody else to do that, or just decide that it's not worth pursuing. And so we can look at how to match Mary up with the objective that she is most effective at accomplishing, and measure it. And it doesn't have to be about whether we hire or fire Mary necessarily, although in some cases, Christian community, Christian organizations, we do need to get better at firing people. But it's about, now we have a measurement that's not, are we going to have to go through the difficult road of telling Mary she's doing a job well or not, but are we meeting the objectives? So now we have a metric.
Yeah, I think you bring out a good point here in when you do not have defined objectives, there is no measure of success or failure. And I would challenge, I had a good conversation actually over the weekend with some friends about whether an organization should be considered a Christian organization or not. And it was a good discussion. We won't talk about that today. We went back and forth and hashed it out. It was great. But I personally hold the belief that, at least at this stage in life, Christian organizations fail, Christian ministries fail because they do not have a single defined objective. They always have an underlying motive, which is to share the gospel or to build relationships to share the gospel. So their ultimate mission is not to fix the refugee problem or to take care of orphans or to care for widows or feed the hungry. Those are all the physical, what we've been taught is you have to meet the physical need of the people in order to open the door to meet the spiritual need. And I agree with that on a personal level. But where that starts to fail is when an organization has an underlying motivation that is now competing with what their stated mission is. So for instance, if I said my mission is to fix the refugee issue in Greece, I want every single refugee to have asylum. I want them to be taught Greek. I want them to be able to find a home, a place to live, right? And start to integrate into the culture here. That would be my mission. But now when I come to this decision of whether I bring someone onto my staff because they're not a Christian, right? If I work with a certain church or a certain organization to allow them to come and serve alongside me, because my underlying, let's say that there's a Muslim group, for instance, that has started a hospital nearby, right? They also have an underlying competing motive of sharing Islam. So we become very territorial in who we work with. And sometimes we make decisions not because it is actually going to be what we are trying to accomplish from our humanitarian mission statement, but now we start to shift into this underlying competing motive that is actually taking a higher position than what the purpose of the organization is. So I have a real problem with organizations when they are not making decisions based on what their mission statement is or what their purpose as an organization is. That's true in business too, right? We get distracted. We start trying to serve a target market that's not who we're supposed to serve, to try to take advantage of picking up a little extra profit here and there. And we take on projects that are too big and out of scope, and therefore you fail or you don't accomplish it in the most effective way. It's all about focus. But a Christian organization is always going to have this competing motive that ultimately could keep them from accomplishing what their humanitarian goal is, or leave them in an undefined space. Because what I could tell you, Mark, is let's say that was my goal, was to work on or fix the refugee issue here in Greece. First off, that's probably not a realistic goal, right? That's an aspiration. We're always going to have refugees that are continue to pour in until you fix the problem in their home countries. So that in itself would be a poor definition of my actual goal. So let's say that I want to provide homes for 11,000 refugees every year. That's an attainable and measurable goal. So now it's defined. But let's say that over the next 10 years, I don't ever meet that goal. Well, now people are coming to me to hold me accountable for what I'm supposed to be doing. But I have this ulterior motive that says, yeah, but I've gotten to share the gospel with 10,000 people or 5 people or 20 people, whatever that number is. And now it's okay that I haven't actually done what I'm supposed to be doing, which is working on the refugee issue, because my overarching motive, this kind of secret underlying motive of sharing the gospel, is winning out. And therefore, I'm allowed to operate in this space of not solving the problem I set out to solve, but maybe it's accomplishing what I was supposed to be doing. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, it comes down to being clear about your purpose and your objectives, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying that we want to share the gospel with 10,000 people. If that's the case, then you need to be upfront about that and then have a strategy that pursues that and not hide under another strategy necessarily. If you do want to help 10,000 refugees, you can do that by partnering and being part of maybe other networks that accomplish that, and at the same time have another clear objective, maybe that is to share the gospel, but not to mix those two up and then use the sort of opposing metrics or confusing metrics. Another thing I've seen in business is, I mean, this is maybe one of the most obvious ones, is that businesses are designed to succeed, to pay for themselves, to generate profit, and the profit pays employees and owners and so on. Right? There's reward in a business, whereas in a nonprofit or a charity or a ministry, there's often a dependence. Almost always, I suppose, there's a dependence on something outside. So within the four walls of the Christian organization, there isn't built in the strategy to self-sustain. Now, I think in some cases, that's okay. We just have to do what we have to do. We raise the money somewhere because we got to get something done that's very important that will never pay for itself, especially shorter term things and crisis and reacting to very instant needs and so on. We have to do what we have to do. But that attitude has caused a lot of organizations to then continue to operate depending on outside resources. And when I say outside, I don't mean just outside, local resources outside the organization, but sadly, resources that are on the other side of the world often. So the donor is very detached from the reality on the ground, which means then the donor really doesn't understand often what's needed, but they may think they understand. So then they start to dictate terms for what their money does, and the receiving party ends up doing that. Why? Because they want the money. And so you end up with very poor strategy on the ground. So unlike a company that is beholden to the shareholders, and what the shareholders in the company want is very clear. In this case, so if a shareholder they're going to want the company to do the best thing, execute the best plan to make money so the shareholder gets a profit. What does the donor want to do in these situations, right? Again, it's another mix of motives, and it's not just the fault of the Christian organization. The donor sometimes does things out of guilt. They do things because they have extra money lying around and they need to do something with it because they want a tax receipt. They may have some kind of pet project in their own head that, something they wanted to do 20 years ago, and now they finally get to do it because they failed in their past. There's all kinds of reasons why donors do what they do. And they're not necessarily in the best interest of the objective of the organization they're trying to support either. So all of that, it sort of comes down to this concept of ownership. Sustainability, I believe, is true sustainability is not the ability to raise money from somewhere in the world. That may sustain you for a short time, but it's not sustainability. It's not your ability to sustain. It's your ability to depend on a reliable donor. But donors aren't always reliable. And we can't make long-range strategies because we never know if the donor is going to be there past the next giving cycle. So it creates a bit of a conundrum there. But ownership is based on, sustainability, I believe, is based on ownership. It's the attitude that this is us, this is ours, these are our objectives, and we're going to build a way of sustaining this that we can predict, we can count on, that's reliable. I think that's not that affects not just the flow of cash that we need to operate, but it also, that sense of ownership also comes back to the sustainability of the idea, the strength of the idea, the innovation that can flow into that idea. If you have a mediocre idea, but somebody outside is paying for it, you'll continue the mediocre idea. But if you own it, and that idea is mediocre and it's so-so, you'll start to be motivated to actually improve the idea, to try new things, because you own it. The story that sticks in my mind forever is when we were living in Uganda for 5 years. I rode what they call a boda. It's a little 100cc motorcycle taxi. There's 70,000 of them all over the country. And over a 5-year period, I calculated I took about 5,000 trips on those things, enough mileage to go across the continent of Africa and on those bumpy little motorcycles. And early on, I was on one of them that looked brand new. It was a beautiful little bike and a nice driver. And I said, "Hey, you got a new bike?" Because many of them around there, they were, falling apart, and the shields on the mufflers were broken. And if you didn't hold your leg the right way, you'd burn yourself, and all kinds of little issues with it. And he said, "No, this is 3 years old." I said, "What do you mean? It looks brand new." He said, "Oh, I own it." He said, the other people here, those drivers are driving somebody else's bike as a job, but this one I own. So I take care of it. And whenever he would, stop or be waiting for his passenger, he'd be there cleaning it and wiping it down and so forth. And that was a great example of ownership. You own it, you take care of it, you maintain it, and you sustain it. And I think there's a sense in ministry that, I don't know, maybe this is God's thing. God owns it and he's going to take care of it. There's some truth to that, but it doesn't take a responsibility away from us. And then there's the sense that if the donor is paying for it, the donor owns it. So we have this transactional model of funding, where if some outside person pays for my ministry, then in a sense they own it. You wouldn't say it that way, but the attitude that comes out of this is this detachment from the attitude of ownership. I think there's a lot we can learn from the business community there. in how it's run. It's a bit more competitive. Sometimes it's a bit cutthroat. And I'm not saying we should give up our character and our values in anything that we do, but there's so much that we can learn about that attitude of ownership.
Yeah, ownership mindset is a core value that I most certainly hold for myself and definitely in the organizations that I look to work for. When you come into a situation, even as an employee, I'm not an owner in any company currently, but when I come to work and I'm going to sit down and do my job, at the end of the day, it is my job that gets done, regardless of what everyone else around me does. And when you take this extreme form of ownership on yourself, it doesn't ensure success, but it ensures that you have done everything that you can possibly do to make sure that the task that you have been given is accomplished. And so I think that you're right when you come to, and this kind of comes back to that split mission, that split objective. But when you come into a situation in a ministry where we do have this almost mentality of we all own it, or there's a board with multiple people. There's this idea in some churches, it's called plurality in leadership, which I think is a good concept in some ways, and I do think that it is something that we can strive for, but it's very difficult when you come into a situation and there's not one person who is accountable for a job being done, because now you have room for blame. I've done a lot of project management, and I'm a huge believer in single source accountability, because if you don't have single source accountability, you cannot have ownership mindset. For instance, if I'm going to assign a task to someone, so we're working on a big project, everybody has their role. I'm never going to assign one task to more than one person. Now, if that task needs to be split, let's say that it's too big for me to handle or I don't have the expertise, you're going to come to me, Mark, and you're going to say, okay, Maddie, I want you to build a website. I'm going to say, great, I can build us a website. I don't actually have all the skills that it takes to build a website. But at the end of the day, I am accountable for getting that website built, regardless of how many people I utilize, regardless of who I take each individual piece of building a website to. If you come to me in a month from now and you say, all right, Maddie, where's the website? And I say, oh, well, you know, let's say that you actually told Anna and I to build a website. Now I have the room to say, oh, well, Anna was supposed to be working on this. And then she can say, well, Maddie was supposed to be working on this. And it creates this conundrum of who is ultimately responsible for what is going on here. And so when you have objectives that are clear and defined of what success looks like, and then you assign single source accountability, and then that person embraces an ownership mindset, now you're setting yourself up for success. And now you can make decisions on success and failure. So if you came to me, Mark, and you had assigned the project to me and Anna to accomplish, then both of us are now technically responsible. How do you make a decision between which one of us didn't do our job? Maybe you just get rid of both of us, right? That might be the answer. But if you came to me and it was my job to do it and I didn't do it, now you have the opportunity to lead me or coach me in very specific ways as to how I can improve, what I can fix, or make the ultimate decision that I might not be the right fit for the organization. That's a real issue that I have in ministries that go after couples. They come to a married couple and they ask them to do a single job. And I have a whole nother issue with it because they want to pay them one salary. So we won't even go into that. But specifically in churches, you have, they look at people and they say, oh, this is a nice couple. They can accomplish this role. If within the couple, again, there's not one person that is assigned accountability, whether it be the male or the female in that relationship, it creates this opportunity for the ball to be dropped. You can't have two people that are over a department. You can't have two people that are ultimately in charge of something. You have to establish who is the ultimate decision maker. And so I think that's a large reason why when we talk about small ministries, most of the time you have a couple that is going to go and do it together, but I think it's important that between the two of them, they decide who is going to do what role, right? Who is going to have ownership over which piece of it. And that way, the donors and the supporters and the mission as a whole can hold each person accountable, whether they're married or not. I use that as an example because I see it often, but I, I think the concept is.
I think there's yeah. I think that applies. The single source accountability applies also to another thing that's been positive, I think, in the Christian community, and that's this whole movement toward collaboration and partnerships and networks. The problem, though, that I've seen with that is that it's just like that couple. You have a network that is now trying to be sort of a partnership. They want to move from a network to a group that actually does things, and yet no one's responsible. So, the outsider will look in and say, "Hey, it needs leadership," but the mentality in a lot of Christian networks is, "Hey, leadership is bad." Now, I'm overstating it a bit, but I think the tendency or the message we tend to get is leadership in partnership is bad because nobody wants to lord it over the others, and so you want this diversified base of leadership. So if everyone's a leader, then no one's a leader, and you don't know who's accountable for the shared objectives of that partnership. So we have the same kind of problem there, and I've argued for a bit of a shift back to maybe revisiting the role of leadership in a collaborative context. How do we not give up that single source accountability and yet function in a place where there's many multiple partners involved? A lot of leaders, though, this is where it gets a bit tricky, is movements. When we come to the concept of movements aren't controlled or owned by any one person, and yet movements thrive if they have the right kind of leadership. And so, how do you marry those two areas, movements and business practices and nonprofits? So it's a fascinating topic, and probably another podcast we need to pick that up in. But how do you have excellent leadership that is responsible and accountable in all these different types of structures? Because I think we're moving into an age in the world where we're going to be exploring, and there's going to be new structures coming onto the scene that we don't even understand yet. And those structures are going to challenge the nature of business. So we're talking about what can we learn from business? Yes. But even business, along with nonprofits and faith communities, are all going to be swept into a new world where there's new things that we're just barely starting to understand. It's almost like the virus that we talk about, the new variants of COVID, and the longer it exists, the more chance there is for new variants. And each new variant, you don't know what you're going to get. So things are evolving. And they're evolving quickly nowadays. So it's going to be fascinating to track with this. I just want to bring up a couple of other things here that I think are important. In another conversation we had, we talked about the scarcity mentality. And I believe that, I've called this the poor man's attitude in other conversations as well. We come from a community of 1 billion plus people that have no lack of knowledge and experience and relationships and money and hope. And yet, almost the standard, feeling, the standard emotion of most Christian organizations around the world is we're struggling. We're making it month to month. We're waiting for new resources so that we can do something more. Why is that? So there's a giant disconnect that I'm trying to figure out. But if we start with this scarcity mentality, then I think we're stuck in it. But we need to replace that with something that is, I guess, a little closer to what we might call the entrepreneurial spirit. You see immigrants coming to Canada, the US, maybe, and other countries in the West where there's been, trouble at home, and they end up immigrating, and they bring brilliance, they bring ideas, they bring commitment to something they want to do, and they start from nothing. And in 10, 15, 20 years, they build very successful businesses from nothing. They could have come saying, we have nothing, therefore we have no hope. But they bring something and they make something out of it. What is the mentality that we need to change in Christian circles, in the faith communities, to celebrate and mobilize the resources we have, rather than be stuck in this perpetual sort of catch-22, we don't have resources, therefore we can't get resources, and so on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought that you bring up. And I think you have to start by identifying what are some of the core beliefs around money, to be honest. And that's the ultimate resource that we're talking about here. I think that we study the New Testament and we see these concepts of the disciples and the early church, and the ideas that are taught to us are that these people, what did they do? They went and sold everything that they had, right? So that they could now go and share the gospel. And I think that maybe what we've done as a church globally or even locally is when we look at individuals who have something, who have resources, we in essence have this viewpoint of they're living in the world. They're not living for eternity, because we have this core belief that this world is not our home. Therefore, anything that we invest in this world is wasteful, in a sense. And I think that when we treat money or resources as though it is a bad thing, Mark, I know that you're probably a great example of this. Could you imagine if you were living in Greece and let's just say you had a yacht? We were talking about this when we were out on the island on Eliphanesis. We saw this huge yacht and a helicopter came and landed on it. There were all these people, had a great time. And we had this conversation about the fact that because of the life that you've chosen, you personally could never have a yacht, or you would lose all your supporters, right? And it wouldn't even matter if you were using that yacht to house 100 refugees on it, right? You have a yacht. Mark has a yacht. He doesn't need support, right? And there's a lot that's tied around that. And there's this line of what does it mean to use the resources that we have available to us for the kingdom versus viewing resources as a negative within themselves. But I'm not sure that you can overcome the scarcity mentality until you can overcome the core belief that money is bad or resources are bad or you are selfish if you have them.
Yes. Some of these issues come down to some theological issues as well, which we don't want to get into right now, related to the kingdom of God. Is it something future? Is it something here? And I would tend toward not tend toward. I would strongly believe that God has called the kingdom to be here. He wants us to celebrate it. He wants us to live and thrive here, and here and now. And so, yes, we tend to sort of always be living in the future rather than the present. But anyway, that's another podcast we won't get into right now. I just want to end with on one more simple topic here about innovation. And you know, from country to country, let's say you're starting a business, and you could go anywhere, any country. You're going to look for a country that has an infrastructure. By that I mean maybe a legal system that will make it positive. The tax system, right? You don't want to pay too much taxes. So you're going to look for some favorable situations there. You want to find places that have the workforce, the labor pool that you need for your particular business. You want stability, right? Political stability and so on. So there's various factors you would consider. So those are factors outside of the business. But you have a choice, fortunately, because we do have, many countries in the world and different sort of regimes that we can choose which best fits our business. And some of those countries are better for innovation than others, I think. And you can argue with me if you have another point of view. But some are better for innovation. Some reward some risk taking. Some reward scientific exploration more than others. And that context matters. So I think there's some external factors. And then there's also, of course, the values and the culture, the character of your business. Are you a learning community? Are you always striving to innovate and to look for other ways? Or are you stuck in a box of doing something over and over again, even if it's not working? So there's certain things that drive innovation in the business community. What can we learn from those things for the nonprofit community? What are some of the external factors that perhaps need to be created? I guess what I'm saying is what can we do that's outside of any one organization, but as a collective that we can do globally to nurture or encourage innovation in the nonprofit sector?
That's a big thought there.
It's a question that's fascinated me. The Mission Critical isn't about giving all the answers, but it's raising sometimes just the question and saying, yeah, it is a big thought. Something that's happened in the science community has been these I guess it's science and business. It's been these prizes, right? So who can be the first company with no help from government or public funding to put a person in space, and this happened a number of years ago. And the fruits of that we're seeing actually as we speak. Last week it was Richard Branson went to space. And I think any minute now, Jeff Bezos is going up, right? And that all started from a few external initiatives. It wasn't one company. It was some other association. I can't even remember who it was that said, let's create a prize to sort of get people moving and thinking and create a little bit of fun in the process, right? Let's some healthy competition here. We don't have that in the nonprofit sector. We don't have that in the Christian community. We just go on doing what we're doing and occasionally creating networks to continue to discuss the fact that we need to be doing something differently, but with no single, what did you call it? Single point of accountability, single source accountability, and not much leadership. We're facilitating dialogue, but to what end?
I think there's an overall, and I think you would agree with this, Mark, lack of strategic planning, both on a global scale and in a small scale. I'm really big believer, and you and I have talked about this in the past, but why do you have ministries that can continue to operate ineffectively, essentially? Why do you have people that don't have the right skills doing jobs that they are not equipped for? I think, again, there's a core belief here that we say, oh, I can't tell you the amount of times, well, God uses those who aren't equipped. Yeah, he does. But can you imagine how much more a person who is equipped could be utilized to do what they know how to do? Or if you spent the time to equip yourself for a job, you talk a lot about leadership, and I know L555, that's the center of what you're doing is equipping leaders. But when you have people who are trying to accomplish an undefined mission and they're lacking the skills and they have a core belief that resources are scarce, how could you possibly solve the issues that are as large as they are in our world today? You have that right there, that's an equation for failure.
I love how you said that, and this whole discussion raises some really fundamental issues that we need to wrestle with. I mean, they're scary. We sometimes ask a question like we just did today, right? And we say, I don't know. But at least we're starting to talk about it and starting to ask questions. We have so much more to learn, to explore, so much more adventure as a community. And that can be that those journeys can be walked hand in hand and sometimes in hybrid ways with the business community. So I just found the notes on the what we call the X Prize here. Just in closing here, I'll share this with you. This was in 2004, and it was for putting someone in space. And the winner of that was Richard Branson's Spaceship One project. He got $10 million for that, for winning that prize. That was 2004. Now, what are we, about 16 years later? Partly from the motivation and the excitement of that healthy competition, we are now seeing this week for the first time members of the public going into space. Okay, so let's get real. Whether that's how do we solve refugees or world hunger, or the big issues of the world, or some of the more smaller ones that are related to your country or your city. What are we going to do to actually get a lot more creative? Stop being so lazy and just maintaining the same old kind of thinking, and let's actually care enough. Let's care enough to pull ourselves together and say, what's this going to take? And be really tough in our self-evaluation, or invite other people, invite the business community to speak into the faith communities and say, hey guys, we need to tell you some things we've known for a long time. What you're doing there, it just isn't going to work, right? Now, we're not putting faith communities down. Faith communities do phenomenal stuff, have phenomenal impact in the world that the business community can never dream to have. But together, as humans working together, we can see breakthroughs that we've never seen before. Thank you, Madi. It's been great having you on this podcast. We hope we can get you back sometime in the future. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mission Critical. If you enjoyed it, please send in your comments. From time to time, we'll have an episode dedicated to addressing our listeners in the comments. Please subscribe and share with your friends and family. And remember, life is short. Live with purpose.